September 22nd, 1974. It's week 2 of the NFL season, and we find ourselves in Denver for this AFC matchup between the Pittsburgh Steelers and the Denver Broncos. More than half a century later, this game would be remembered, as little did anyone know what was about to transpire on this day. During the offseason, the NFL passed a rule stating that any game that was tied at the end of regulation would go into a 15-minute sudden death overtime period. Whereas overtime only existed for playoff games before, now it would exist for regular season games. And the Broncos-Steelers regular season game was the first game in NFL history to ever go into overtime. For the first time ever in a regular season game, we would go past the 60-minute mark. The purpose of this system was to curb the insane amount of ties taking place on a weekly basis, and to make the standings easier to understand from a visual and a tiebreaker standpoint. Which is why it's hysterical that the very first overtime game in NFL history in the regular season resulted in, you guessed it, a tie. As despite the Steelers and Broncos scoring 70 points combined across the first 4 quarters of the game, with the score tied 35-all, neither team could break the deadlock and score a single point during the OT period. Oddly enough, that was the only game during the entire 1974 season to end in a tie. So chalk it up to one of the greatest bits of irony in NFL history that the first time ever that a system was used to break a tie, the game itself ended in a tie, and the system did not work. You might know about that bizarre controversy between the Steelers and the Broncos. However, you probably don't know about this one, as in the game that took place the year after that infamous tie game. Because when Pittsburgh and Denver faced off against each other in a rematch 1 year later in 1975, the game was marred with controversy, not because of what took place on the field, but rather what took place off of it. And it all had to do with the Steelers trying to screw people over, and amazingly enough, baseball and the ongoing World Series. If you ever wondered how baseball and football could interfere with each other and cause a giant controversy that has nothing to do with the usage of a multi-purpose cookie-cutter stadium, then wonder no more, because this is the story behind the bizarre drama involving the Pittsburgh Steelers, NBC, and the 1975 World Series. Before I talk about the drama in question, make sure that you hit that like button down below, subscribe, and turn on that notification bell so you don't miss a single video that we post on the channel. We post every single day about the weird and the wacky history of the NFL, and we go live every single day as well. And every like and subscription helps as we try and grow this community and inch closer and closer to 70,000 subscribers. Thanks in advance for your support, and with that in mind, let's talk about the game that the Steelers stole from their fans. Before I talk about the actual controversy at hand, we need some context to understand the importance of the game being played, as well as the other sporting event taking place at the same time that was about to throw a giant wrench in all of this. It's October 12, 1975. It's week 4 of the NFL season, and we find ourselves at Three Rivers Stadium in Pittsburgh for this battle between the Denver Broncos and the Pittsburgh Steelers, in a game where maybe, just maybe, a team would actually win this time. This was a big game for both of these teams early on in the season. Both the Steelers and Broncos found themselves at 2-1, with both teams trailing their division leaders by a game, with the Steelers trailing the 3-0 Cincinnati Bengals in the AFC Central, and the Broncos trailing the 3-0 Oakland Raiders in the AFC West. A win here helps keep pace atop the division, which is especially important when you realize that only 4 teams make it to the playoffs, and there's only one wildcard spot to go around, so the margin for error is razor thin. Considering the fact that the loser of this game would drop to 500, there was a lot to play for here, to say the least. And sure enough, this time, there would be a winner in the battle between these two teams, as when all was said and done, it was the Pittsburgh Steelers who came out on top, taking it by a final score of 20-9. Future Hall of Fame wideout Lynn Swann had a sensational day, catching both touchdown passes, and the Steel Curtain defense showed off their stuff by not only holding the Broncos to just 3 field goals and no touchdowns, but by giving their quarterbacks nothing but fits back there under center. Charlie Johnson went just 12 for 31 for the Broncos, completing 38% of his passes with no touchdowns, 2 interceptions, and a passer rating of 30.8. which is worse if it did nothing but spike the ball into the ground on every single play. And when John Hufnagel came in the game to relieve him, he did no better. In fact, he did even worse, as Hufnagel went 0 for 5 with an interception, posting a passer rating of 0.0, which is your passer rating if you just don't even show up. All in all, it was a dominant performance by a dominant team, and would definitely be a sign of things to come for the defending Super Bowl champion en route to his second Super Bowl title later on in the season. However, this Broncos-Steelers game was not even close to the biggest game on the sporting calendar that day. Because while the Broncos were taking on the Steelers for quasi-supremacy in the AFC, two teams were duking it out for supremacy in baseball, with this game right here taking place between the Boston Red Sox and the Cincinnati Reds. It was Game 2 of the 1975 World Series, back when the World Series played weekend games during the day and had no problem competing against the NFL whatsoever. My, how the times have changed. But at Fenway Park on this day, with the Red Sox up 1-0 in the series, and the Reds desperately needing to get a win before the series shifted back to Cincinnati, the Reds came back in the top of the ninth down 2-1 and down to their final out to win the game 3-2 and tie the series at 1 apiece, in what was an omen for one of the greatest World Series ever played. And I bring that up not just because it was a great game and a great series, but because this game, much like the Steelers game, started at 1 o'clock. And this game, much like the Steelers game, was set to be televised on NBC, seeing as NBC had the rights not just to the World Series, but to the AFC package of games for the NFL. And seeing as the World Series took priority for the 1 o'clock slate, the Steelers game was not going to be shown by the Peacock. Now, by itself, this isn't anything unusual. You can only show one game at a time. Conundrums like this routinely came up when the World Series was played on a Sunday afternoon and interfered with football. And while the problem stunk, there was an easy solution to this, seeing as cross-flexing did not exist. When a network decided that it did not want to televise a game due to prior obligations, the game reverts back to the home team, and the home team can sell the game to any network it so chooses in the local market. As an example, seeing as NBC had the rights to the AFC package of games, if the NBC affiliate in Kansas City didn't want to show the Chiefs game because it had another obligation that day that they wanted to air instead, the rights would go back to the Chiefs, and they could sell the game to another station, whether it be the ABC station or the CBS station or any of the other stations out there. This led to some bizarre controversies that we'll touch on in future videos, especially when it came to a different game during that same week of the 1975 season. But while this would be weird, this wouldn't be too much of a story. Because the game sold out and was allowed to be shown on the air on local television by law because of the legislation passed in 1973 restricting blackouts in the home market, the Steelers would just give their game to another station since NBC was doing the World Series, right? Well, not quite. Because a ton of owners did not like the blackout rules one bit. They hated the fact that the games could be shown locally if they sold out. If a game was on TV, it meant that fans who had tickets were more inclined to stay at home and watch it there and not go to the venue, which meant a loss in parking sales, a loss in concession sales, and even a loss in merchandise sales. There were definitely a fair amount of no-shows each week if the game was on TV, as the number of no-shows from 1972, as in the final year where every game in the home market was blacked out regardless of whether it sold out or not, to 1973 and the rest of the mid-70s, absolutely skyrocketed, to the point where it wasn't uncommon to see a stadium that sold out be filled to just 80% capacity. To give you an idea of how much owners hated the blackout rule and wanted to keep home games off the local airwaves, the Eagles intentionally sold obstructed seats in Veterans Stadium that no one would buy because you couldn't see anything because they knew that they could black out the games if no one bought those tickets. You can learn more about that by clicking the card in the upper right corner. So when the rights for this game right here reverted back to the Steelers and back to team president Dan Rooney, he saw an opportunity to go back to the golden days. If the Steelers didn't want to sell the local rights to this game, they didn't have to. They could just say, we're not going to do it, and the game just won't be shown locally. And sure enough, that's exactly what happened. Because despite the game being sold out, with nearly 50,000 tickets selling at Three Rivers Stadium, if you were in Pittsburgh, the only way to watch the Steelers play this game was in the stadium and not through TV, because the Steelers self-imposed a blackout. If NBC wasn't going to show the game because of their World Series obligation, then you're not going to see it at all. As Dan Rooney said, it was time to stand up and be counted. Keep in mind, the Steelers would be the ones profiting from selling the rights to the game to another station. They could have gotten 5 figures, which today might not seem like a crazy amount of money because of how big the NFL is. But when you realize that, number one, this is 1975 money that we're talking about here, and number two, this seems like free money without having to do anything, that's a lot of money to turn down. Rooney thought he was doing a service to the fans by saying that they couldn't watch their team play. But in reality, he was doing the exact opposite in the eyes of many, and was doing a disservice by preventing Steeler fans from being able to watch a game that they otherwise would have been able to watch. And this is especially true when this was never a problem in Pittsburgh in the first place, and when it felt as though Rooney was just projecting the problems that other markets have onto Pittsburgh, almost like criticizing someone for being a part of Gen Z and being addicted to social media when said person doesn't even own a smartphone. The first week of the modified blackout rule in 1973, 9 games, including the Steeler game, were sold out. Of those 9 games, as you're seeing right here, the Steelers had, by far, the fewest number of no-shows. They averaged about 1,500 no-shows per week, which was pretty typical even before the blackout rules took effect in 1973. People who bought tickets to the game ended up going to the game and didn't stay at home to watch it on television just because that was an option. Turns out, if you buy a ticket to the game, you're actually inclined to go to the game more often than not, especially when the weather is good, your team is good, and you don't want to waste the money. So for Rooney to say this is unfair to the fans who buy tickets and that's why we're doing this, when this wasn't a problem in Pittsburgh in the first place, and when those are 2 completely different audiences, just doesn't seem to make a ton of sense, and seems awfully short-sighted on his part. Did the Steelers have every right to do this? Absolutely. They had every right per NFL rules to black out their own home game despite it selling out. As if NBC didn't want to televise it due to the World Series, the Steelers did not have to make the effort to sell it off to another station. But just because you have the right to do something doesn't necessarily make it the right thing to do. I know a lot of Steeler fans would have loved to have been able to watch their team beat the Broncos, especially if they tried to get tickets to the game but couldn't because the contest was sold out, and sold out way in advance, I might add, to the point where that was never even an issue. Just because you think you're protecting one class of people doesn't mean you actually are, because you might be hurting a significantly bigger class of people that had no impact on the class you're trying to protect whatsoever. Unless you wanted to listen on the radio, which is obviously not the same, you were straight out of luck on this day in 1975 if you were a Steeler fan and wanted to follow along to your team playing. Because in 1975, Dan Rooney stole the Steelers off of TV. Be sure to like and subscribe if you have not done so already, as it helps the channel out a lot. And check out my other channels, JG8 for the history of college football, JG7 for the history of baseball, and JG9 News, where we talk about all things happening in the NFL. Join me every Wednesday night at 8 p.m. Eastern, where we'll play live NFL trivia for cash prizes. And make sure to join me live, as we're on stream just about every single day. And thanks to all our Patreon members and our YouTube members for helping out the channel. See how you become a member and show your support financially in the description down below.